some arbitrary map was made and said, you are all going to be considered Asian American and Pacific Islanders. But I think that when immigrants have come to this country, they realize that our numbers are very few, and if we really want to get something accomplished, we need to find ways to work together.
And welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Urbay. This week we continue our Women Thought Leader series with Irene Bueno, who served in the Clinton White House. She has since co-founded NVG, a lobbying firm which specializes in healthcare and a host of other issues. She focuses on outreach to diverse communities and multicultural health organizations. So welcome, Irene Bueno. Very good to see you and have you here.
Nice to see you, and thank you for having me.
As a thought leader in the Asian American community, what is the biggest issue affecting Asian American women?
I think one of the biggest issues for Asian American women is that our lack of leadership and representation at the highest levels. We're very fortunate that we do have some leaders in our community, including Senator Mazie Hirono, who's been a leader in the Senate, particularly on health and judiciary issues. She's one of the few immigrants in Congress and really speaks for the AAPI community. We also have Senator Tammy Duckworth, who is a decorated veteran and has been a leader not only on Asian American women issues, but also veterans issues. And on the House side, we have Chairman Congresswoman Judy Chu from LA, who's also been a leader, and many, many more. So I'm very hopeful and encouraged that Asian American women will have more of a voice, at least here in Washington, D.C., in the halls of Congress.
Do you think that there's a voice lacking because Asian American women, because of cultural attitudes, don't want to step up and become leaders, or because of prejudice against them?
I think that Asian Americans in the United States, while we've been here for many, many years, including back in the 1700s when Filipinos came here, most recently are when Asian Americans have really been involved in the policy process. Whether you come from a country where politics is something that you don't want to get involved with, or you ran away from a regime where politics was not something that to be trusted, that there was some discouragement, I think, on the first generation of Asian Americans to get involved in politics. But now we see with the second generation and others realizing that it's really important that our voice, Asian American women's voices, are heard at the top levels. And honestly, there weren't a lot of role models out there. We did have Patsy Mink, who was an incredible role model, but we didn't have that many. I think as you see more Asian American women run for office and succeed, that you will see more Asian American women run. And we saw it in this last 2018 election.
Certainly did. Do you relate to, for example, the election out of Detroit of a Middle Eastern woman? Yes. I know Middle East and Asian are slightly different, but some people kind of lump the two together.
Of course. I celebrate any diverse woman who gets elected to Congress, because it is very hard to be elected to Congress. It's very polarizing. You have to work really hard. You have to overcome discrimination or racist feelings from potential voters. So we celebrate Congresswoman Oman's election and Congresswoman Tlaib's election, and also Deb Haaland and Congresswoman-elect Davids, the first Native Americans women to be elected in Congress.
Exactly. And do Asian American men face the same amount of prejudice? Are there more leaders? I know there was a governor of the state of Washington, and there have been other Asian American men in prominent political positions.
I think that in American society, I think the men sort of led the way. I mean, you think of Senator Inouye, who passed away a couple of years ago. He was one of the first Asian American senators from the state of Hawaii. And then we had Governor Locke, who later became Secretary of Commerce and then ambassador to China. And then the first cabinet secretary was Congressman Norm Mineta from my hometown of San Jose. So they really did pave the way. But at the same time, they also realized you need to look back and help others. And I've had the opportunity to work with all three of them to make sure that Asian Americans, both men and women, rise to a level of prominence.
I just want to tell you a funny story because I covered Congress when Inouye was there, and there was a joke that went around about he and Senator Boschwitz, of Jewish American immigrant also, were standing by the side of the Senate floor looking at the proceedings, and Rudy, as he was called, said to Daniel Inouye, we are the only two guys in here who are not running for president, and that's because we can't. And of course, the Constitution, if you're born in a foreign country, you can't run for president. But anyway,
I did want to mention that so far in the 2020 election, there are two women of Asian American background who indicate that they may be running for president.
Kamala Harris.
Senator Kamala Harris, and then most recently, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii. So I think that's an example of Asian American women really finding their voice.
Do you think that they will have a good shot? Will their diversity be an added asset, or will it be a burden, do you think? I
think with Senator Harris, she has been elected statewide. She is many offices, Attorney General, and now is the Senator. She has an incredible nationwide profile. She has a great story, and she's very powerful and effective. So I think for her, I think that would actually help her to use her background and her experiences as why she would be an effective president. So I don't think it would hurt her. But at the same time, I recognize in this country that there are people who might have some questions about someone from a different background. But I think she is the type of senator who can bridge that gap and educate people in a respectul way.
It's interesting because she's half Indian American, half African American. And I always wonder, to me, Asia, since it's such a huge continent, what do Asians from India, for example, have in common with Asians from, for example, like
Philippines.
Yourself, the Philippines?
Yeah.
What is there? I mean, we may group them together, but do you all group yourselves together? And you speak different languages, you have different religions, you don't look like each other. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, some arbitrary map was made and said, you are all going to be considered Asian American and Pacific Islanders, right? But I think that when immigrants have come to this country, they realize that our numbers are very few. And if we really want to get something accomplished, we need to find ways to work together. And I think historically, India and Pakistan have been, lifetime enemies. Yet when they come to this country, you find everyone working together. And I think it's because of a common cause, a common belief in the hope of the United States and America, and the belief that if we work together that we can accomplish something.
Interesting. And I noticed too, while I was researching for this interview, that there are huge gaps between Asian Americans from different countries in terms of the poverty level. When taken as a whole, Asian Americans are just about precisely where all Americans are, I think Asian Americans are 12.6% versus the general population being 12.4%. But the Hmong, large groups of whom are in Minnesota, they have a 37% poverty rate, and your country of origin, the Philippines, only 6% poverty rate, so doing much better than Americans as a whole. Why is that?
Well, as I indicated, the Asian American Pacific Islander community is very diverse. I think there's 30 countries or so that are, considered as part of that. And the immigrants from those countries have different experiences. So you talk about the Filipino and Indians. They have come here
and Chinese
predominantly have come here because of their skills, because of their educational attainment. Filipino doctors go to West Virginia. Indian doctors go to other areas that are underserved and need those kind of services. You think of the Southeast Asians that you mentioned, the Vietnamese, the Hmong, the Cambodians. Their experiences, they came to the United States as refugees. Many of them, escaping fallen Vietnam, and they basically had what they could carry with them. So some of them had skills, some of them had challenges when they arrived in this country. But I don't want to say that because you're a refugee that you cannot make it. And I think of Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Stephanie Murphy was a refugee. She escaped Vietnam with her family in a rickety boat, and they thought they would perish in the middle of the ocean. But she was so fortunate that a U.S. naval ship passed by and rescued them. And since that time, she tells that story.
And now she's in the house.
She's in the house, and she has, committed her life to public service because she understood that she was given this opportunity to live in the United States, and she wants to give back. And she has now come from that rickety boat to become a member of Congress and the new co-chair of the Blue Dog Caucus.
Amazing story.
Yes,
really amazing story. You, as we've been talking about, representing Asian Americans, representing 30 plus countries, what part of Asia, well, we were just talking about refugees, what part of Asia is most likely to send refugees, meaning not well-educated Asians to America?
Well, I guess right now it just depends on what's happening in those countries, and obviously individuals, if they have personal experiences that qualify them to be a asylee or refugee. But I think the other thing that you find when people have diverse backgrounds, whether educational levels or professional level, one of the tenets of our immigration law is that family immigration and unification is important. So in that case, you do get people of different backgrounds who have different experiences. But when they come to the United States, whether they have a higher education background or not, when they come here, many of them take that opportunity to go to community college and go to college to better themselves. So you hear discussion about we're not allowing the best and brightest immigrants from around the world. But when they get here and are given that opportunity, they're so hungry to succeed and to learn. And I think that is so important. And family reunification is so important, especially to the Asian American families.
Now, there are stereotypes about Asians I want to talk to you about. The tiger mom. Has that hurt or helped Asian American mothers? Well,
we were talking about that earlier. I know the stereotype. I know the type of mothers there are. But I think, Asian Americans are all different. We want our children to, in some ways we are the same. We want our children to succeed. We want our children to grow up healthy and strong. And we just have different ways of approaching it. I am not a tiger mom. I really believe in supporting my daughter where she is. She puts enough pressure on herself, and a lot of children these days do have a lot of pressure. So I think it's important to support them and to know that you will be there no matter what happens. We know we went through that. We have ups and downs, and to be critical of them when things don't work out, I don't think is necessarily helpful. We need to teach our children to be resilient. We also need to teach them.
So you think you overall would say that tiger mom is a negative stereotype?
Oh, I think so. Although some people might think it's a positive one, but I think that one of the things that I think of as the tiger mom syndrome is that you can't go on play dates, you can't socialize, you can't do these other things, which I think are so important to succeed in this country. You need to learn how to socialize. You need to have leadership skills. You need to have different experiences, because when you go to college, when you go into the work world, you need to have those experiences. So in that way, I think that tiger moms can be a negative thing if that's all they do is, all you need to do is study, have good grades, good test scores, and go to the right schools, because that's not what success.
Is it even possible to be a so-called tiger mom unless you're a full-time mom?
Well, the person who wrote the book, I believe, is a law professor. So she somehow managed to be a tiger mom. There's a way that moms can be in a room and pressure you without physically being there. I think I learned that growing up as well.
Especially true with cell phones.
Yes, exactly.
And of course, Crazy Rich Asians, the big movie.
Yeah.
What was your thought about that?
So When I first heard about, I read the books, but when I first heard about the book, I thought, well, there's already a stereotype that Asians are all successful, we're the model minority, which, as we talked about earlier, really isn't true. There are some that are successful, but at the same time, there are some Asian Americans that are struggling, and we need to recognize that. But when I read the books and watched the movie, it actually talked about Asian Americans in Asians in an Asian country of a certain class. And a woman, a Chinese American woman, and her experience interacting with that. So I focus on the Chinese American woman and her mother, if you recall the story. I don't want to spoil the story, but she left.
I saw the movie, but I did not read the book.
So she left an abusive relationship in a country where she did not think she'd be protected and brought her daughter here. She was working in, restaurants and just made her way. And in the book, she becomes a real estate agent and, is successful in her Chinese American community. That's more of like what the Asian American experience is. And one of my favorite parts of that movie is when Rachel gets on a plane to go to Singapore and she packs a meal in a little plastic container. And that is something that immigrants do because we think, well, we got to save some money and we're going to put food in a little container and bring it on the plane with us. Of course, they were in first class, so, they didn't need that. But that's just, I think how a lot of immigrants and Asian American immigrants think.
That's a very interesting angle to pick up on. So you have spent most of your working life working to improve access to health care. Is that a more critical issue for Asian Americans than for other minority groups?
Yeah, so Asian Americans, I think, face a lot of challenges. Most Asian Americans actually are foreign born. The increase of Asian Americans in the United States really occurred between 2000 and 2015. And many of them...
And actually in 2015, we should note that which I want to ask you about, Asian Americans overtook Hispanics as the largest immigration group. I think most Americans aren't aware of that.
Right, and by 2055, Asian Americans will be the largest immigrant group, surpassing the Hispanic Latino community.
Of the U.S. population.
Yeah, the U.S. population.
Right.
But as you said, that many Asians come from different countries, so many of them speak another language at home. So I think one of the barriers for Asian Americans accessing quality health care is a language barrier and also cultural. And it's different how healthcare is provided in some countries than it is here. And the other is that a lot of Asian Americans have small businesses or they work for small businesses that don't offer health insurance. So the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, really made a change in the insurance rates of Asian Americans to the point where there's almost little disparity between many people are still uninsured, but the disparity had almost been eliminated when you had 1 out of 6 Asian Americans not having access to health insurance. So when there's discussion about the ACA being repealed or pulled back or Medicaid not being offered, that really impacts the Asian American community and work with those organizations that fight to ensure that.
So the biggest problem is language barrier? And I guess because Asian Americans aren't what they call in the Romance language group, it's harder for Asians to switch from Tibetan or, the Thai languages or one of the 500 plus Indian languages spoken in India to a Romance language and to speak it. Then say, for example, somebody from Europe or Latin America speaking French, Spanish, Italian.
Yeah, and I know, haven't looked at the numbers lately, but even if you wanted to learn English, there's not enough classes. You think of Asian and any immigrants, they're working probably 1 or 2 jobs and trying to find the time to also learn is difficult, but I think that they are willing to do that and want to learn. But it is a difficult language. It is as if one of us moved to China or the Philippines. It would really be very, very difficult to learn that language, especially as an adult. But we do find that, children who come here very young, they are bilingual, which is, I think, really incredible. And I hope that schools and the society value that. In European countries, kids speak all different languages. When people have 2 languages or 3 languages, we should embrace that and support them and not tell them, you can't speak that language when you go to school, that you can only speak English. So I hope that we do that.
Now, let me ask you about that Harvard lawsuit. Mm-hmm. A bunch of Asian American advocacy groups are suing Harvard because they say that if there's a quota on Asian Americans who are admitted to that, and symbolically all Ivy League schools and all schools. Yet, Asians are at this point about 6% of the U.S. population and represent 22% of the Harvard student body. Is that discrimination?
Well, I guess I would question the premise of the lawsuit. There is an organization that has been known to challenge any kind of race-based programs around the country. And I think that in this case of Harvard, that they are challenging a policy that I think is actually a good policy, and Asian Americans actually do benefit from it. I think having a university setting that has diverse people from different backgrounds is really important in terms of students learning. If everyone has the same background, I don't think that there are those opportunities to learn.
Interesting. And how are Asian Americans faring under the current president?
Well, I think it's been very difficult, starting with the first days of this administration.
But he's not he's not attacking Asians the way he has been attacking Hispanic Americans or Hispanic immigrants.
Yeah, I think it's indirect policies that he or people who work for him are promoting. You think of the Muslim American ban. There are Asian Americans who are of Muslim faith, so it does impact
Indonesia.
Exactly.
Talk about the biggest Pakistan,
right?
India.
There are many. So that. And as an Asian American, whenever I see any community that is under attack, I feel that could happen to us. You just look at, Japanese internment and what happened during World War II. And Secretary Norman Mineta, after 9/11, when he saw that the people were blaming all Muslims of 9/11, he stepped in because he knew what it was like to be a U.S. citizen and to be imprisoned by your own country. So he stood up. So whenever anybody is being attacked because of their religious background, ethnicity, that is something that I think most Asian Americans would stand up for. There's also just some policies that the administration has talked about. The president talks about stopping chain migration. Well, what he really means is he does not want people from from family members joining their family here in the United States who don't have the skills that they think that they should have.
Or who current policy promotes that.
Exactly.
It sets aside a certain number of visas for family members who want to bring in other family members.
Right. I mean, in 1965, our immigration laws were completely dismantled because they did exclude people from certain countries. They did exclude family members. So this was a change that our immigration would be based on both employment, bringing in people who had certain employment skills that we needed, but also reunifying families because that is so important. And then, of course, the refugee policy, that's something that affects, all of us. And that's another policy that, of course, he is trying to change unilaterally through executive orders.
But there aren't that many refugees who are allowed in each year, correct?
There is a limit.
So what is, for example, the Hispanic migrants who are crossing the border claiming refugee status, although they're not being persecuted by their governments, they have real problems in their home countries because it's basically no law and order and complete disorder and chaos and countries being run by drug gangs. But that's different from a government suppressing you because you are of a certain color or, of a certain faith.
Right.
So how do you feel about that? How's Trump policy impacting that?
I think the way I feel about it is you should look at each individual case because sure, we can say all of the people who are coming over are experiencing it, but they actually might have different experiences. And the law is very specific. There's case law about, whether something qualifies you for asylum. And those cases need to be looked at on an individual basis. And you can't just have a blanket policy or say you're not going to process people. And then I'm concerned about people waiting across the border. People are very vulnerable and that generally doesn't happen. We don't usually keep people outside in vulnerable situations as their applications are being processed. So it's very concerning.
Well, thank you so much, Irene Bueno. This has been a very enlightening half hour, and we really, really appreciate your time. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.